Okay, welcome everybody. I know others might still be joining, but thank you so much for attending this live webcast event today. We really appreciate it. Hopefully it's going to be fun and informative. It's called Survival of the Fastest. We're going to talk about what we call the 15-30-60 xIoT rule here at Phosphorus around proactive IoT OT threat prevention. My name is John Becky. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Phosphorus. I'm joined today with our special guest, John Terrell, who's our CISO here at Phosphorus. We are very happy to be with you today. We have a decent amount of content, so we won't spend a lot of time on intros. Just look at John's background on LinkedIn. It's incredibly fascinating. I mean, we're really honored to have John with us at Phosphorus, and his input on what we're going to cover today will be tremendously insightful. And so, John, thanks so much for joining me today on this one. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm flattered.
Fantastic. So everybody, let's get started. We're going to talk first around, I mean, you hear the word xIoT, and I'm out there a lot talking about this. I know John is as well, but some of you might not be, exactly clear on what we mean by this whole xIoT thing. It really refers to what we call the extended Internet of Things. Remember, all of these devices, they're really just embedded smart devices. And just think about anything that's not traditional IT is here, right? But all of these devices have many things in common, right? They're purpose-built. They're run on firmware, specific types of firmware, and not a lot of types of firmware. I mean, at the end of the day, there's really just a few main types of firmware that run these devices. It's things like Android, BSD for IoT, kind of industrial stuff. It's BusyBox and real-time operating systems like VxWorks. There's not a lot. They're network connected. They speak TCP/IP. You can't put CrowdStrike and Tanium and your favorite agents on them and call it a day. They cannot take endpoint agents. And John, there's tons of different categories of these devices, right?
Oh yeah, I mean it's everything that you can possibly think of. It's door controllers, it's cameras. Like I kind of think of that stuff as kind of your white collar office type of stuff with like printers and phones versus the robotic arms and the infusion pumps and all of the other stuff that's kind of a bit more kind of in your face.
Exactly. Yep. So, and we'll cover a lot of these categories today. And I think we're going to come back to this whole extended aspect, because in any environment you're in, trust me, you're going to have all types of these devices in many cases, right? And here's an example. So here's an example of what we call kind of an extended manufacturing environment, right? And the thing is to remember that if you're in manufacturing, you might be focusing on your PLCs, your HMIs, your robotics, and all these types of things, which is oftentimes why we're not big advocates of kind of verticalized security for these, because if you're focusing on these types and you're forgetting things like industrial printers, your cameras, HVAC controllers, gateways, environmental sensors, then you are just as insecure as possible if you're not focusing on those, because those devices can actually be some of the lowest hanging fruit, and they can take down your operations, right, John, about as much as attacking a PLC. Think about ruggedized printers or something, right?
Yeah, for like a hospital, I think it's kind of telling that like a CAT machine, like a CAT scan, like that's core to kind of providing care. But then you forget that you've got a printer that puts out like a wristband, and you can't admit people into the hospital, and yet that printer is a thing that you could take over. It might have default passwords on it. It might have some kind of a security problem that you're not going to have a CrowdStrike agent or something like that on it.
Exactly. And like I say in healthcare all the time, things like HVAC controllers, even cameras, can be
Sure.
considered life-critical devices in those environments. So the example of this is why we call it extended. All of these are in your environment, almost regardless of what vertical you're in or what type of industry you're in. You have all of these devices. It's hugely important to make sure you understand all of them and are having visibility of all of them. So here's should, I mean, I love this, John. I mean, this, and we could do just 50 slides on just showing you different shots of Shodan, but we just picked a few of these, right? On any given day, just throw a few of these in and be stunned. I mean, it might look like a small number, 8,600, but why would anyone have a UPS connected to the open internet in the first place, especially given that pretty much 99% of those devices are deployed with default credentials, which everybody knows. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. APC, for example, right? So, I mean,
100%.
This is fun, right? I mean, look at these numbers. I mean,
I'm
cameras, it's insane, but
I'm constantly shocked how many of these people have a public IP address. Like
yep.
it's kind of difficult to get them these days. Like most of that
So
traffic
true.
it gets like natted. I don't know what service providers that these people, they're just like plugging in directly to like a cable modem. It's shocking.
It is shocking. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about some of the attack surface, but things like PLCs, I mean, on any given day, you could find sometimes twice as many if you do a search on other types days. But just, I mean, okay, I got 10,000 to go, almost 11,000 of them to go kind of try to look at. It's a huge amount of numbers on those, right? So, right.
A thing, John, that I think is also kind of nuts is it's not just the stuff with a web interface. It's also stuff that speaks obscure protocols like BACnet and Modbus and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yep.
Like how building management gear makes its way onto the public internet is just I don't have a good answer for.
Yeah, I mean, DNP3 serial over Ethernet. I mean, when you
Yeah,
think about these industrial, OT type industrial devices, it is mind boggling. Many of them are very old, but I mean, these old kind of key protocols, like you said, the BACnet devices, and I mean,
yeah.
it's crazy. But look, here's the state. I mean, and we could talk a lot about the state of these devices, but at the end of the day, we can just show you the three main ones, and you're going to hear this today, right? And we think of these from the perspective of they're unknown, they're unmanaged, and they're unmonitored. All of these devices, right? So from us, we'd say 70% of these, incredible, 70% of these devices are deployed with default credentials almost across the board. And in some of the types of devices you find, it's almost 99% of them are almost always deployed with default credential, but on average, right? Firmware is end of life, 70 plus, almost 75% of it, right? You got 68% of these devices with CVSSs of it's kind of 8, 9, and 10, right? So I mean, it's an incredibly poor state of security hygiene, John.
When Chris Phosphorus is my co-founder and CEO had first started to talk to me about this, I think the brief description that he gave me was it's like the 1990s again.
Yeah.
And the more and more that I start to pour into this, like it's not just default passwords, it's the same default passwords.
Yeah.
It's admin, or the password field is blank, or it's for like door controllers, it's Tyco.
Yep.
Like there's so much of the stuff that is floating around, and the CV scores. I mean, it really is going back to the 90s. I was recently going through a device, and the front end web app is entirely written in shell script. Which is bananas, right? Like the entire thing is in a CGI bin, like directory, and it's got command injection bugs just all over the place. And
Yep.
it really does feel like we're going back 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true on the night. I mean, just all of you, just go back to say 1994 and think about what was happening with laptops and all the computers at that time. And this is it, right? It's like, make sure you have a password, make sure you change it, make sure you have the latest update, make sure you're not opening everything and connecting to all this stuff. I mean, and this is what it is today. So all of us in this security, landscape, we live in 1994, certainly every day. And look, it matters. This stuff is costly. And this is just kind of the latest IBM figures. You can find others, but this is just the latest kind of IBM figures of the cost of a breach from 2023. It's looking at the global average, about 4.5 million. And look at the United States. It's almost double. It's 9.5 million average breach in the US. It's the number one country in cost, right? Healthcare, of course, continues to win at the highest average of cost. It's certainly an attacked industry. And from an IoT, OT perspective, man, they are vulnerable. There's absolutely no question. You just see kind of the time to identify a breach and time to contain it. It's just a mess. But here's the thing, right, John, about this stuff is sure, can you take data? I mean, you can exfil from these devices, and you show it, John. I show it when I go out. I can
Sure.
show how I can exfil from a camera. I can exfil from a PLC, but it's really that the operations can take down your business and take
So,
down operations. So in addition to the cost and this and the data, John, isn't it about physical?
so
That's what, right?
yeah. So John, I've got kind of I'm not going to call it a hot take, but the perspective, I think that at least from a legislative standpoint, most of our laws around kind of breaches have to do with the loss or the disclosure of data. And I
Mm-hmm.
think healthcare is a great example of that,
Yep.
where like, okay, it's got PII, it can get out there into the public, and you'll pay fines and disclosure notices. But I think we've overemphasized data over the
Yeah,
device itself, and that
absolutely.
these new cyber physical kind of concepts, the device is the target, and the loss of the device or the manipulation of it is actually the end goal. It's not just exfiltrate data or to ransomware stuff. It's that you can manipulate that device or to take its function offline. And what I've kind of casually referred to sometimes is kind of corporate Stuxnet.
Yeah,
And that there
yeah,
is this idea that the devices are the target. And I think that's a change in how we need to start to think about these things, because compute for the longest time was kind of seen as like this generic thing that was like it didn't really matter the software or the infrastructure. You could
yep,
redeploy pretty easily, and
yep,
then you would consume that kind of differentiated the differentiated data. I think that's not necessarily true of IT, and definitely not of this kind of xIoT world, right?
yeah,
If I
yep,
lose an Active Directory forest, it might take me a week to rebuild that, regardless if I've got the directory or not. Versus like how much time would it take to redo the firmware for 1,000 cameras,
yeah.
or the door controllers or infusion pumps, or like these things that are so critical to kind of day to day like running a business.
Yep. It's so true. And I mean, and again, I mean, Gartner coined the cyber physical systems, and it's very true. I mean, again, think things like infusion pumps are critical infrastructure. The physical damage that could be done with these is off the charts. And it certainly is one of the big reasons why this is deadly serious. And the one thing we didn't talk about is just the number of these, you know, John, there are about 70 billion of these devices today. When you think of all of these extended Internet of Things devices and all those categories and including every single one, think about that, right? Traditional endpoints, there are about as many traditional endpoints on Earth as there are people. So it's about 7 billion, give or take some. That is flat to almost declining. If you look at these devices, they're increasing year to year about 18%. So the numbers are almost baffling,
So
when you think in terms of them, right?
so I kind of have a unique perspective on phosphorus, given that I was one of their first customers in a
Yep.
previous role. And I think it was really eye opening to go from I thought I had a handle on what my environment looked like to
Yep.
realizing that I had 5x the number of devices that I actually had. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh wow, that's insane that I've got 4,000 people, and I thought I had 4,000 desktops plus some extra laptops and an array of servers. And it turned out that I had 12 to 13,000 xIoT devices that just had gone off the radar the entire time. And it's stuff that you might think for a financial services firm, like, sure, I've got a one-to-one mapping of phones, but then it was cameras in the hallway, it was door
Mm-hmm.
controllers, it was
Mm-hmm.
the temperature sensor inside of a data center, it
Yep.
was the UPSs, it was
Mm-hmm.
just all of these things that you kind of take for granted.
Yeah.
And the IT department was not installing most of it, which I thought was kind of the other side of it, that like you just didn't realize that a lot of other teams are starting to plug stuff into the network, and these devices are, what, like whether you want them there or not, they're going to be used, and they're going to have the connectivity that attackers are also going to need.
Well, no question. And this is why the attackers are focusing on it. And, we're not going to spend a ton of time on kind of stories from the trenches, but first, let's just, on any given day, you can see the headlines. These are just a few, right? I mean, you might have heard about the Pennsylvania water facilities and a few other facilities that were hit by the Iranian hackers. They attacked a PLC that happened to be made by an Israeli company. What you're seeing on the left is actually the window that appeared to all the operators once they hacked it, right? You've heard, there's been countless sessions to Congress by the FBI, the DHS, the NSA, CISA, warning about attacks on our critical infrastructure, in many cases saying, look, we've been compromised already. The question now is, what is it and what could they do? And they could just wreak havoc and cause real world harm. You've got the Volt Typhoon on the Chinese side, which was a lot of news. And then just lately, we put out a video on this about the Blackjack Group's Foxnet, which actually attacked the actual gateway that had all the POCs. And what did they do? They went after John default credentials on that, right?
So one of my favorite hacks that was reported on in the last couple of weeks was I guess the group behind it is being called Lifting Zmi or Lifting Zmi.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, but it's Russian institutions that have identified Ukrainian hackers that have been breaking into these Russian companies. Now they're all state owned, but the Ukrainians are using Starlink as their connectivity to then break into PLCs that are on the public internet that control the elevator system for these buildings that have default
Crazy.
creds in them of admin and secret. So there's nation state conflict happening, and they're starting with default creds.
Almost every time. I mean, we'll talk about it, but just if you look at CISA, I mean, we'll just hit it, but CISA every time, they just hit the same three things, right? Please change your default credentials. Get 1111, off of there, please. Like change the default, ports, extraneous ports and protocols, insecure ports and protocols, wide open, firmware so old and unpatched. So we'll hit that. This is one, John, that you put an awesome, informative video out on. Talk a little bit about the regress SSH. This is awesome.
So what's kind of silly about this is that it's 2024. The CVE for it is from 2006 because the vulnerability got reintroduced into the code base. So it's been there now for a number of years, and it has to do with a race condition with a signal handler that, frankly, it's not a thing that should happen, and it's kind of bizarre in that it was this technique that a researcher named Mark Dowd had found in 2006. And the general idea was that if you could control enough of the connections, you could exhaust the resources and kind of feng shui the heap into such a way that you could get like code execution. Mm-hmm. And it's this odd thing. It takes, call it 6 to 8 hours to trigger. So it's not going to look like benign traffic. But it's a thing that for the last, call it 10 versions of like OpenSSH, you now have remote code execution, which of all of the things that are publicly exposed on the like public internet, that's actually one that you're expecting. So that's got real kind of dramatic implications. Yeah, I think the only thing that saved a lot of places is that they don't upgrade very often. So a lot of them are just running such old versions that they never got the new patches.
Yeah. It's anyway, look at the video to dive in deeper on that. But it's another example of some of the latest ones. I love that regression one. Again, of course, pipe dream won't spend a lot of time, but look, I mean, this is one that keeps me up. Anyone who's looking at kind of nation grade, nation state kind of grade, military grade, kind of nation state grade malware and attacks. Pipe dream keeps everyone up. Look, this is in the wild. We haven't found it specifically yet on a critical infrastructure in a specific system. We know it's there. It likely could be there in stealth, but we know it's out, it's open, people have it. And this thing is incredible. It does not need any kind of vulnerabilities on the device itself. It could care less. It's looking at the inherent elements of physical attributes of that device. It's really meant to be easy press button. They don't need some sophisticated hackers. And you can just see, I call it a Swiss Army knife. Just look at the different tools you have: Evil Scholar, Bad Omen, Dust Tunnel, Mouse Hole, Lazy Cargo. I mean, this one, John, I mean, this is kind of, if you're going to pick one to just say, wow, this is out there, this is pretty scary, I'd say this is a good one.
Yeah, I mean, to like your point, the reason a lot of this stuff is not observed is a lot of these devices are intended to be read only. So these things are manipulating them live with the inherent functionality that was there as a feature.
Yep.
But a feature for like one person is a series of tools for exploitation for another. So yeah, they're using the devices exactly as they were intended.
Yeah, exactly. And so now, as an example, here's an HVAC controller. We talked about this, right? In many cases, these things are a mess from a security perspective. They're almost all deployed with default credentials. Low sophistication to try to get at these things. So we talk about, you can see attacks on these, but just think again, when we talk about the extended Internet of Things, if you're focusing on certain things and you're forgetting things like your HVACs, we can talk about healthcare, manufacturing, food production, everything. And you can just see across all of those, taking down one of these devices can literally shut down operations. I mean, across any of these. And John, you touched on it a little bit just with healthcare and others, but this is an HVAC controller, and look at what it could do across just a few industries.
So I think that's a good point, but like there's also something that when I speak with customers, I try to kind of separate the world into two buckets, where one is a group of companies where these devices are in your face and it's part of core to what you do. And that second bucket is the group of people that sent everybody home for a pandemic and said, we don't need an office anymore, and the devices in it are just assumed to not be important. And I kind of want to call out that second bucket because it's tech, it's law firms, it's financials, it's everybody who came back to the office and said, oh, that stuff doesn't matter. But then you start thinking, well, what if I can hot mic the CEO's phone? Or I can listen in to the conference room in the run up to earnings when the board is there. Okay, those become problematic. Well, I don't care about printers. We didn't need printers at home. Well, what if it's the general counsel's printer or the head of HR?
Yep.
Yeah, sure, cameras might not matter that much. Like, what if I can read your Bloomberg term? So it's stuff like that where you start to realize, oh, I thought it was a dumb device, but that device does something, and if I can operate it in the functionality in that cyber physical world, you start to have kind of this jump from, it's not a point of reinfection or persistence, it is the actual target.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, and again, this is just what's actually on premise in these environments. What you were saying exactly, but what about half of your workforce is remote working from home? I mean, these devices are all over them. You can't ignore any of it, right? So that's kind of the state. I think it's important when we're going to get to the 15, 30, 60 kind of rule and this framework and kind of how we talk about it. But I think what got us there, and what got us here at Phosphorus, is kind of the sense of the current state, right? And I think if you're going to talk about the current state, we got to start with visibility, right? And at the end of the day, we talk to so many. I mean, we're deployed in very, very large enterprise across about any vertical you could find. And regardless of any company, and we're talking, right, John, very sophisticated companies. These are not companies, right? These are not organizations that do not have the most sophisticated cyber around, but across all of them, about 80% will tell you, we do not know. We cannot identify 60% probably 60 to 50% of all of those XIoT devices we have. We just know it. We know we don't know all of them. So this
Sure.
visibility gap is massive. And if you've got 50 to 60% of these devices, you don't even know where they are. You may have 100 locations around the globe. You may have remote, think of utilities and energy and oil and some of these industrial environments where they have very remote environments with a lot of these devices. They wouldn't even know how to see them. But those numbers are pretty staggering, John.
I think it was as like Donald Rumsfeld used to talk about the known unknown.
Yeah,
They're like, we know we have a problem. We don't really know how big it is,
yeah.
but it's definitely there. And I think that's what a lot of us are experiencing because I've not run into a customer yet that doesn't have a vulnerability scanning program, that
Mhm.
doesn't have some idea of what the state of the network looks like. Some might have NetFlow and other things for passive collection, but they know they've got these devices and they just don't know what to do with it. And that could be, like a temperature sensor
Yeah.
that's like plugged into the wall that you don't even
Mhm.
realize is a thing that's on the network. That
Yeah.
was a problem with I think it was the New York Times almost like 10 years ago. It was an IP enabled temperature. It was a thermostat, and
Mhm.
the Chinese had broken into the thermostat and just hung out for like 6 months.
Yeah.
And every single time they're like, okay, we got them off the network. And they're like, haha, no, you didn't. So just stuff they didn't expect. And they look at that device every single day. They walk past it. And it's just this benign thing that you don't realize is a network device.
Yeah. And it's a massive piece of the attack surface. Everybody, like I said, it's about 1/3 of the overall attack surface can be these devices. And if you're sitting there and you just don't know half of them or more, let alone their risk assessment, let alone thinking about doing something about it. But this is just starting with visibility. And I like to say, how did we get here? For a lot of you on the industrial side, on the OT, industrial control systems, industrial IoT, even in medical environments with sensitive medical devices, um, we understand there's an allergic reaction to active scanning, as we call it, right? And I think of one of the big reasons we got here. Well, this is actually a screenshot from a leading vulnerability assessment tool talking about scanning fragile devices, most specifically operational technology IoT. And it's like skull and crossbones. It's like, please do not do it, right? And
Yeah.
again, these technologies are awesome. The reality is that they've been built and they are meant to talk to traditional IT assets and technologies, not IoT OT. I call it waterboarding when they go talk to them. You can't throw one of these devices over and ask it if it's running SMB and scan 10,000 ports. It will die, right, John? I mean, that it's one
Yeah.
of the reasons why how we've gotten to
The,
this state.
well, they're so inherently noisy. And I think that the evolution of it was, this started with port scanners and then it kind of evolved into, can we start interrogating the services? Can we start to look for banners? And then
Mhm.
can we start to look for checks against that? And it kind of expanded into now authenticated scans. Can we look at the software that's installed? And a lot of that was, I think, this idea of looking for completeness, and
Mhm.
that the people that ran these wanted to say that they got 100%. So that meant that instead of scanning, the 10 ports that probably matter, or the 50, or like whatever it is for that kind of profile, what it turned into was 65,000 for everything at once on some network devices that were never intended for it.
Mhm.
So it's just this abundance of both traffic, but also the interrogation of services in ways may that may not kind of fail gracefully. So these things
Yeah.
can start to break because they were kind of intended to be on an air gap network, and they
Yeah.
were like, oh, just don't let the vulnerability scanners near it, and you'll be okay. And the OT folks were like, yeah, cool. We don't talk to the IT team in general, so sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a legacy issue where the IT and OT world kind of came up in parallel and almost deliberately didn't want to work with each other because one thought they were part of kind of core, whether it's manufacturing or healthcare or something like that, that we're separate from it. Which
Yeah.
is why I
Yeah.
think also for the that second bucket of companies that I was talking about before, where you don't think of it as core to your business, a lot of those devices don't get plugged in by the IT team. They get plugged in
Correct.
by the facilities team.
Facilities, operations, even physical security
Yeah,
sometimes. I mean, there are so many of these different teams. And I mean, and again, the whole idea of air gap, I mean, really people, there's really aren't any air gap left mostly
I,
in the world today. This stuff is so,
I mean,
I mean, right.
an air gap network is pretty uncommon. Even basic segmentation is just not that common. Like
Yeah.
it's okay for people to admit kind of the dirty secrets that a lot of us have, which is our networks are mostly flat, and we all know it. And
Yep.
our CMDBs are garbage, right? Like we don't have a good asset image.
No.
And those two
Yeah.
things kind of persist for everybody, but it's not because we're bad at our jobs. It's because it's hard.
It's
And like,
hard. Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's,
it's complexity, it's scale, it's process, it's running a security team and not controlling the IT team, and then facilities and corp tech are plugging stuff in. Like there's a lot of moving pieces, and
yeah.
it's okay to admit that you have that problem.
Yeah. Well, it's true. And I mean, and again, because of that issue with the inherent allergic reaction to kind of this active scanning, we have, of course, a whole nother breed of these solutions. In many cases, fantastic technology. These are kind of the passive network monitoring. They're listening. They're kind of waiting for these devices to talk and capturing the packet, doing deep packet inspection. So, and again, but because of that fact that you're kind of listening, it's not as accurate. It still adds to this kind of issue of this visibility gap. We talked about the kind of brute force scanning, but when you think about kind of the passive guys, it's that assumption, right? It's kind of low. This is why a lot of these organizations say, I don't know. I think I maybe have maybe half on a good day visibility, and even in some cases, I'm not quite sure exactly what is what. There's a lot of infrastructure dependencies, so it's very heavy, it's very complex, it's costly. I mean, you need to back up a truck of iron in many places and put in spans and taps to do this, which means it's costly, it's manual. And again, at the end of the day, although these technologies are providing ultimately a lot of security for organizations today, there's no remediation, John, in
So
addition to all this.
yeah, the passive side I think is part of that kind of IT and OT growing up in parallel and not talking,
Mhm.
because the passive side is also this, for lack of a better term, indoctrination, that a lot of the network vendors have kind of been pushing for the last, call it 25 years, saying, well, there's no solution to OT. There's no solution to IoT. These things, you can't install software. We can't change them. We can't, but we can observe them. We can monitor them. If we
Mhm.
see people that are poking around and attacking them actively, maybe we can do something then. And I think that's kind of an antiquated way of thinking, because fixing the stuff was just difficult. Nobody had done it yet. And I
Yeah.
think it was a hadn't done it yet that kind of brings us to where we're at now.
Yeah, it's so true. And we're going to talk about this is the current state. We get it. We're here to talk really now about kind of the future state. But before we do, you can look at, so Gartner, as we said, they are on the forefront of this. Literally, they are the ones who are focusing on. They've created the market guide for CPS protection platforms. They moved away from kind of this vertical kind of focus to more of, look, this stuff is, they're all cyber physical systems. It's all over. So they've done this. They've got the market guide. But the thing interesting about what Gartner did here is, for the very first time, they started to hone in on some of the inherent issues and the state of security on these devices. And here's their quote, right? And they hit it. These are the 3 points we hear all the time. Operational systems deployed with their default credentials unchanged. Ports of all kinds of systems and all kinds of remote locations are wide open. SSH, Telnet, God knows what else, right? The number of vulnerabilities just grows. At the same time, patching is a mess. No one's patching. So here's Gartner saying, hello, like we need to actually focus in on these things, and we need to kind of start to fix them, right? Which gets us to really the purpose of this whole, our discussion here today is focusing on what we do about this and why the speed of it, the efficiency of it, the effectiveness of it matters, and actually trying to proactively and in a more preventative way, not only protect these devices, but actually manage them. Right, John? So it's really
Sure.
the idea of going from a passive state to a future state. And you've done that. I mean, you, as you said, you were the first customer of Phosphorus. Uh, I believe, you were probably focusing on that passive side. And one of the reasons you looked at this was looking at more of a proactive fundamental remediation element of
Yeah.
this, right?
So when I got the question posed to me by my boss at the time was, what is our IoT security strategy? And I think he had gotten that topic because he went to a conference and he wanted to be a thought leader and say that he's got something for it. And I kind of shrugged it off and was like, we're just going to ignore it because it's, they're dumb devices. We know it's a point of persistence. Like, we know that they're on the network, but like, there's nothing out there to really to get a handle on it.
Yep.
And like, the device is just a thing that might get infected. And my boss, who was one of the richest men in the world, also had $1 billion+ art collection, and he liked to show it off. So we had anywhere, call it on average $250 million in art on display in the office at any given time. And we had these these $200 Axis cameras with default passwords and 6-year-old firmware that were actually doing the monitoring. And it took me a couple of weeks, and I had this epiphany. I was like, oh God, this is going to be a sequel to the Thomas Crown affair. Like someone's going to break into this camera, they're going to pause a feed and walk out with a $10 million piece.
Yep.
And I was like, okay, I got to figure something out for this. And that's when I had started to kind of realize this is a problem. I don't have the people to do this. The scale of doing it is tremendous. And frankly, the people who are responsible for it, like, I could step in and do it for them, but like, it's the facilities team, it's corporate security, it's folks that, and well-intentioned, very bright folks, but your security guard is probably not going to be ultra technical. So like, it presented this kind of mismatch of, now I've got this problem and I don't really know how to tackle it. And I think that when I started to talk to Phosphorus, that's where, hey, we've got this thing that's kind of different, and we think we might be able to actually fix a problem for you.
Yeah, and that's the key. And so, what does it mean to actually fix these? In other words, like, what's the key to preventing these threats? We know there's a lot of current state passive kind of detection based solutions. We get it. But as Gartner said, you've got these fundamental inherent kind of security issues on these devices. The state of security and hygiene on these devices is terrible. What does it mean to actually fix those, to more prevent them? And it's discover them, and it's to do that comprehensively and safely. Yes, actively. We'll talk a little about it. We completely rediscovered discovery from the ground up in a way where we can do that safely and comprehensively, so we can actually fix that visibility gap. It's the risk assessment of it. So not only do you need to find these devices, but you need to assess them for their fundamental posture. You need to understand the metadata of these devices. Are they running default credentials? What firmware are they on? What ports and protocols are open? What is the state? What are the configurations? Everything about it. Proactive password and device hardening. So as Gartner said, right, default credentials, ports and protocols are wide open. This is the device hardening where you're going to actually, we need to address this issue of the default passwords and things like Telnet and SSH, and if they're more sophisticated, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, HTTP, FTP, wide open on these devices. And of course, automated patching and remediation. So actually fixing this issue of the fact that firmware on these devices on average is 7+ years old. We showed you the CVSs. 68% of these things have 8, 9, and 10 CVSSs. So this is really the key to, when we think in terms of prevention, it's kind of these items, right, John? I mean, these are the kind of key elements to
Yeah.
it.
I mean, and this is in such a stark contrast to doing passive collection, right? That this is actually fixing something.
Yeah.
I've got some friends that have have coined a term called Carroll's Law. So I'm tooting my own horn here a bit, but the saying goes, any problem you can buy your way out of is the cheapest problem that you have. And this presupposes two things. One, you can afford it. And two, that it actually solves the problem. And a lot of times with security products, we give people a lot more features and capabilities, but we also expand the number of problems that they've got and the amount of work that they've got now. And I think with this, the ability to actually change the credentials, to upgrade the firmware without having to manually do that, that fixes a problem.
Yeah.
And I just don't see a lot more out there that can actually fix those things.
Yeah, it's true. And this brings us to the framework. Why do we have this framework, the fit, what we call the 15-30-60 xIoT rule and framework? It really comes down to the fact that not only do you need to be able to fix these devices, you need to find them all, you need to assess them, but you need to do it efficiently and quickly, because this matters. I think it is, we call it survival of the fastest. I mean, this makes a difference. So it's essentially what this is saying to you is, on any given day, if you just take our technology, or, we're the only ones right now that can do these kinds of things. We hope there are more. But on any given day, you leverage this technology, you should be able to essentially actively, safely, and effectively and efficiently discover and assess your assets in as little as 15 minutes. Again, John, as we say, that's taking an example of what we call like a Class B network.
Sure.
And a t-shirt size, we call that like maybe a large network. Pretty decent sized network, though. We could, in about 15 minutes, you should be able to get that kind of visibility. At the 30-minute mark, you should be able to have the ability to start hardening your devices, start rotating your credentials at scale, automated way, start shutting off things like Telnet, start hardening devices from a configuration perspective. And at the 60-minute mark, you should be able to begin on the devices you want to, on the estates you want to, that you can and you will be able to actually start remediating and patching the firmware on these devices. Does it mean you're done in 60 minutes with everything? No, it means that you should be able to discover in around 15 minutes. By the 30-minute mark, you're starting to address your passwords and configure ports and protocols and configuration. By about the 60-minute mark, you're starting to patch on what you do. I mean, this is essentially what this is saying. And this is what we call it, a rule, John. It's a framework. I think we want to make this more of a rule.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
For lack of a better term, it's kind of close to magic, as I've seen in a while.
Yeah, it kind of is. And how do we do that? I mean, again, this is the platform we have. I think when we think in terms of this, the safety and the efficiency, it is really being able to go finally discover these devices in an active way that's very safe. The thing that's unique about us as John, you learned when you deployed the technology is we actually talk directly to these devices in their native languages and protocol. So we understand when a device is very sensitive. We take a very different approach to our active discovery. But it is really the idea that one platform, without all the hardware, with no agents, that's very effective. One platform can across all find these devices, fix them, and manage them, right? And we say without hardware or hassles, simply because you need to be able to not only do this quickly and efficiently, you need to be able to do this in a way that's safe, but it's also not as complex and costly. We don't want it to be prohibitive, right, John?
No, I mean, it's a really straightforward deployment. I've been shocked at how quickly we can get things up and running. For some prospects, I've got a proof of concept piece of gear. It's a little 7-inch computer that I can fit into a suit jacket, and essentially can sit down with a customer. And when they're like, hey, yeah, I don't know that I have that problem, I'm like, let's plug in and see. And I mean, within minutes, you're starting to light up the network and see what's there. And it's very, very telling.
Yeah, and again, this is the whole host of things. You have to kind of be able to do all of this, and in addition, it's very critical to integrate with all your solutions. We get it. You have all your host of different technologies, whether it might be a PAM you have, it might be CMDB, it might be your SIM. It might be, there's so many different types of technologies. It's critical to integrate with them as well. But that's essentially it. And I mean, the use cases can be very, very specific, right, John? I mean, here's just a few, but I mean, these are some of the things our customers are doing every day.
So as a thing that I thought was really, really interesting, and when I when like I first start to think about this, I'm thinking, okay, they've got a better scanner, but they've done this unique thing about being able to instrument the devices and upgrade the passwords and the firmware. And I'm like, okay, but once I do that, like, what's next? Because like,
Mhm.
don't I get all the value from it? And then I'm like, oh, I can work with all of my IT assets and all of the investments that I've made there and use you guys as like the way of communicating with the xIoT world and serve as almost like a translation engine. But
Mhm.
then there's also kind of this management component where you can start to see drift. And
Yes.
we've got one customer, and I love the example that they've given us, which was for the cameras, and it's a consumer bank. So they've got cameras that are in each one of the branches and a third party provider that goes in to do maintenance on. And essentially, they've got all these cameras. They've paid for the brand new stuff, and all of a sudden, they start seeing these cameras that are 2 or 3 like years old, and they're like, "Wait a
Mhm.
minute, like what is that?" And they started to notice where there's this drift, and the third party vendor is just taking old gear from other clients and plugging it in because they didn't want to buy a brand new device. And I thought that was just like a fascinating thing that like, oh, that's what managing it looks like.
Yeah.
The long
Yes.
term is we're not just scanning it to find out that it's got a problem, and we're not just fixing it, we're continuing to fix it and continuing to be able to monitor.
Absolutely. As we know, these devices can change, they move. You could bring them to a state of security. There's a million ways you can, someone can address that and change that. Paperclip attacks, someone can. So it's very, very important to not only do all those things, but actually monitor them. And I mean, we've got a couple, we can run through these quick. We're kind of getting up to the close of the time, but we
Yeah.
have very, very large. This is one of the largest global hospitality companies. This is what we call a 15-30-60 workshop. So think of the rule. In 15 minutes, you should be able to pretty much discover most everything and assess it. By 30 minutes, you can be rotating credentials and hardening devices. By 60, we can actually be patching and remediating devices and the firmware. So this is a hotel, John, a big hotel. I mean, this is literally,
I think it's more like thousands of hotels, but yes,
yeah, yes, between their hotels
right,
and the resorts and
right.
timeshares. And so this is what we did in it. And literally we'll come in the morning, we're gone by lunch, pretty much, right? And you can see kind of the challenges, which are pretty typical across a lot of these. I don't know my devices. I don't know them. They're unmanaged, they're unknown. I've got mission critical devices that I believe are, deployed with default credentials. I've got mission critical device with unpatched firmware and vulnerabilities. And you can just kind of see some of the things we did in a very short amount of time, right? From a hotel perspective, right? And then, of course, we could take another one. So go completely to the other side. That was kind of the hospitality side. What about critical infrastructure, right? So this is one of the largest privately held midstream water management companies. We talked to you about the Pennsylvania water attack, how these guys attacked it. This is critical infrastructure. The government designates this as critical infrastructure. Same thing, very different environment, right? But look at their challenges were essentially the same, right? They knew they had limited visibility. They've got all these IoT and OT devices and all this stuff. They've got all the issues, right? Same kind of thing. So in a very short order, John, we're able to kind of come in and demonstrate this rule and the effectiveness of this. And again, as you see at the bottom, bring the ongoing side is the monitoring, right, John? So once we do this, whatever estate you kind of bring to that higher state of security, now you're kind of at scale and automatically kind of fixing these things. We're actually not just leaving it there. We're continuing to monitor them for environmental drift and things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, for this POV, I think I think they deployed a VM and were up and running in a couple of minutes, and like
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
less than 15 minutes, they started to see, here are hundreds of devices here, and like they pretty much knew immediately these all have the default passwords. We can check these in to into a password vault.
Mhm.
So, sorry, I'll pass it back to you so I can.
Yeah, clearly so. No worries. That's exactly it. And look, here it's across all of these industries, right? I think the thing, this is just the discovery side that again, but before you can even think in terms of going to address and fix these, we need to know exactly what they are, and we need to not guess. We can't be, this is why we had to build discovery from the ground up, right, John? We couldn't be 50% sure that it's a PLC and then it ends up to be a printer.
Right.
We need to know 1000% exactly what it is, right down to its make, model, series, everything about it. But for those of you across other industries, you can just see some of the case studies of the ability to come in and quickly discover and assess these across very disparate type complex networks, some of them very large. You can just see some of the times from the discovery perspective. So we've got case studies across all of these industries. They're all essentially have many of the same types of things. It's just the devices, their environments, the criticality of these types of devices can change, right? But I think the big thing is that, again, discovering them, the visibility, solving that visibility gap is critical, right? But it's actually being able to going from the discovery, what we call the find, to actually the fix. Right. And I mean, that's the key thing here. It's really going well beyond the discovery. We don't want to just report the news and tell you, the poor state of these devices. Once we can actually identify them, we want you to have the ability to move further through that in all of these phases, right? John, to be able to then move from find to proactively fix all the way through to the monitoring side.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a different thing for a security group to be able to actually fix things. Like the function has traditionally been go tell me what the problems are and then go force everybody else to fix things and put onto their plate. The fact that you can take some of that work off and actually do it yourself and feel empowered, I think that's it's kind of a new position to be in.
Yeah, it is. And again, we talk about kind of the maturity model for YOZA. And we get it. Many of you will be sitting there saying, remediate firmware. Like, I'm not going to do that. I may have devices. And again, there's that kind of now, next, never bucket. We get it. Things you want, you can do now. Things, that you might be thinking about doing next. And there's that never bucket where I'm never going to ever kind of address things like firmware on these critical devices. And we get that there may be those that you don't want to do that on. But believe me, you want to know what they are. And so this is kind of the maturity model, I think, for most of our customers. I think you'd probably agree, John. We discover them. Then we can go and do things like super low hanging fruit. Let's deal with the device and password hardening. Let's get rid of those default credentials, put them on a rotation schedule, just like your all of your IT assets that you're doing. And then we can go from there to more things like remediate firmware vulnerabilities on certain types of devices you may have. Again, approach that with the now, next, never type approach. And then from there, the monitoring, of course, which takes place on no matter what, because if you, whatever state of security you bring them up to, you want to be able to monitor. And as you can see, the integration across all these technologies happens throughout. And one of the things I didn't mention, things like the firewall. So we're integrated with the checkpoint firewall, right? To give that firewall the visibility of these devices, so it can make rules at the perimeter around access and network connections to these devices. So I mean, the integration is really critical. But this is kind of the maturity model I think we see across most customers. Would you agree, John?
100%. Like the scanning is kind of a default. The rotating passwords is just a necessity, especially if they're already a default password. Because if they're not, you can make a decision whether or not you want to start to load those passwords in and start to manage them. But the firmware, I think, scares people. But like the rollout's going to look like you're patching things, right? You're going to start with 1% and then 5%, then 10, then 25, then it's something that you get comfortable with over time.
Yeah, it's true. And you can see it. We show you, and we're not diving into, how we do that. We can show you that on another, webcast. But now as we finish, we're just thinking of some of the next steps, right? And John, I love I love these because these are just things everyone in the audience watching should be thinking about before you even want to pick up the phone and talk to us, right,
Yeah.
John? I mean,
The
yeah.
the first person that I would call is your corp tech, your facilities folks, the corporate security. Like I would reach out and find who the other stakeholders
Hmm.
are. Because they likely own these things. And they're also going to be able to give you a good understanding of what's coming down the pipe, right? Like, are they doing a revamp of an office and now they've got a new smart building project that's going to have, 10 times the number of IoT devices than what you thought?
Hmm.
Because that problem is just going to get larger and larger and larger. So I think you start with that and then you transition into what tactical things you can start to do. Can you push some kind of segmentation policy, whether that's with firewalls, that could be a local firewall policy. Like you're protecting yourself from the devices, but the devices from the rest of the network too.
Yep.
Um, so
Yep.
I think there's some things you can start to do, just to get a handle on, is this 10 devices or is this 10,000 devices?
Yeah, exactly. And the various, all the remote workers, I mean, this is really important. All the various environments you have, kind of getting an inventory of those, at least thinking what you might have, and take a guess. The stakeholders is so critical. We hear this time and time again, and we've mentioned it multiple times today, right? You can have facilities people overseeing and deploying these devices. You can have physical security. You can have operations people. You can have third parties overseeing devices. You can have IT. You can have IT security. It's all over the map. All of these teams need to be able to kind of collaborate together, and the ability to have kind of a single view of this, to bring these teams together so they can all see what it is really critical. And then, of course, lastly, just by all means, once you have a sense of this, maybe you don't, but once you look at some of these, schedule your workshop. I mean, as we end here, there's a few things you can do in engaging with us. And here's a couple of them. You can schedule your free advisory session. You could have someone like myself and John, others talking to your teams, gather your teams. If you want to educate your teams on what you saw today, if you think it's helpful for some of those disparate teams to understand some of these things, forget about the product. We can do an advisory session and just take you through the state of this, right? Open people's eyes, make them aware of kind of the situation. You can do that. Feel free. Of course, you can take the challenge. We're going to be at Black Hat. We want to make sure you can come. We're going to have our remote mobile lab there. You can literally come within 15 minutes of our suite and see all of this in 15 minutes. We'll show you the discovery, the hardening, the passwords, the remediation. We'll show you everything in as little as 15 minutes. But of course, if you want to see the product, we can show you the product as well, right, John?
Yeah. I think we're running up on time. Do we want to allow for some questions?
Yeah, we might have some questions. Everybody, let's see if here's one, John, I'll read it. Do you scan everything during market hours? Is it dangerous to scan in such a short amount of time? That's a great one. Do you point the
Sure.
scan at a subnet of devices? All other vulnerability scanners reviews used to have taken stuff down. Okay, so there you go. I mean, that's a lot of points on that, but great question.
The short answer is you can. I wouldn't recommend it. Scanning during market hours is normally not a thing that most people do. We've got a number of customers that do. A lot of those are not financial services, so their
Mhm.
market hours are not the same, but it is during the workday. It's during
Mhm.
an operational period. You can absolutely scan these. You can put in a preventative window, and we've got some places that do it within, like, they've got 33 hours to scan from like a Friday night to a Sunday morning, just because of the dynamics of the different time zones. So yeah, I mean, you can absolutely do that. You can assign this for certain subnets. You can have exclusions. Like, this is going to feel like you get the same control as a traditional vulnerability scanner, but it actually fixes things.
Yeah, and it can do it safely. We're out of time. We had another question just on kind of the deployment. Again, as we said, no agents. This is no hardware. It's very effective and easy. You can be up and running on this. I think I like to say it takes you kind of longer to download the thing than to set it up. So it's very easy. You can do this very efficiently and effectively and lightweight. So no hardware, no agents. More questions we'll have to see on the next one. This is a kind of running series, right? We call this the 15, 30, 60 xIoT rule series. We're going to have more of these. We're going to be showing you this on the next one. We'll dive into it and actually show you the platform, right? Again, I have a podcast called the IoT Security Podcast. Please join that. We have incredible guests on there talking about this issue across about every industry you can imagine. So please check that out. In the meantime, we thank you very much for joining today. John, thanks for joining me and being my guest on this, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And please hit the QR code, check us out. We hope to talk to you soon. Again, everybody, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next 15, 30, 60 webcast series. Thanks, and see you next time.